Welcome to Lessons Learned from the War in Ukraine. Please welcome John J.V. Venable, the Heritage Foundation's Senior Research Fellow for Defense Policy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for this event to discuss what's happened in Ukraine and how each side has done and maybe a little bit about what the United States can take away from it. We got a small crowd here, but no less handsome, strikingly handsome group. And we've got about 300 folks in the virtual office, and want to welcome you all to the discussion. Over the course of our time together, we'll basically walk through each of the domains. We'll start with land, then air, then sea, and talk to our three experts that we've got with us. And I'll pound them with a bunch of questions, and then from there we'll take what we can get from the audience through the virtual question. If you look in your upper right-hand corner, you should see a little tab, a drop-down menu, to where you can actually type in questions. And we've got a great fella up here in the front, Frederico Bartels, who's going to catch those for us and feed them as they come. And so with that, why don't we get started? The war in Ukraine has surprised a lot of people from the get-go. From the 24th of February, when most experts were saying they would not invade, all the way through the mire that the Russians have gotten into. Most folks expected the Russians to be in Kyiv in 3 to 4 days, but the defenses that the Ukrainians have put up has been pretty impressive, as has been the lack of aggression, maybe, and success from the Russian side. And so we want to discuss all sides of this over the course of our 45 minutes or so together. And to help us do that, we've got three exceptional experts with us. Two are here with us on stage, and one is virtual, and we'll talk about each here in just a minute. David Johnson, on my far left, spent 24 years in the United States Army throughout the United States, Europe, and Korea, artillery, infantry, and several other aspects. He is an expert like few others. He was the vice president of SAIC, and now he is here with us as an expert from the RAND Corporation. To my immediate left is Rebecca Grant. Dr. Grant got her PhD when I think she was 16. She's one of the smartest people I know, particularly in the domain of air power. And she runs her own company here, Iris, in the city, and is basically tapped by the air staff on a regular basis for her expertise. And then joining us virtually is that strikingly handsome man right next to the Blue Ridge Mountains. And Brian Clark has also served in the United States military. He was a naval enlisted man for several years and then fleeted up, became a submarine officer, and worked his way to the chief engineer position and the ops officer job at the Navy's nuclear power training unit. And if those of y'all who are familiar with that means he's wicked smart. After retiring, he went to work for the chief of naval operations, ran his CAG, and basically looked after the development of Navy strategy. He worked for CSBA for several years and is now with Hudson, and he is an expert in naval operations, electronic warfare, and autonomous systems. And I'm going to pelt each of them individually, one by one, and if you will, we'll start with probably the most significant, at least from the outside world that we can see, the land domain. And I'm going to go over there and grab a hold of Dave first. Dave, everything that we can see pretty much, all of the things that we're hearing, by and large has to do with land warfare. It's been a tough slog. Could you take a couple of minutes and summarize what you've seen over the last 6 months and maybe how it's changed?
So I think the Russians are acting pretty much true to form. They're doing what they did.
As is always, the challenge here is getting all of the beeps and squeaks things correct.
Can everybody hear me now?
There we go.
Okay.
Now we're talking.
Let me go back really quickly. So I think what we've seen is what the Russians are true to type. They try to coup de main against Kyiv, which they do this because there's a supposition that their force is so formidable when they pull into a smaller state, everybody throw their hands up and say, well, I quit. It worked in Czechoslovakia. It didn't work in Chechnya. It worked in Afghanistan, where they took the entire country down in 6 weeks. It didn't work in Hungary. And they revert to type, which is an artillery army with tanks, and they begin a slow grinding campaign. Because even though they're going to what are called contractniks, which are contract soldiers, the vast majority of the soldiers are not what we would think of as a professional army. NCO Corps, they still have some remnants of the hazing. So, they know what the instrument they have is. They're not confused that they don't have, they don't have NCOs. I think they already knew that. And you see how they operate as an understanding of what the instrument they're wielding is. So they conquer with artillery, and then they occupy with infantry. And that's what we're seeing in the East, this gradual war of attrition that Putin's supposition is, I will outlast them, and I will break their will, and I'm also going to work on the West because winter's coming. When fuel is going to be short, we're already hearing rumblings in the NATO countries, and food is extraordinarily short. If you go back to the Arab Spring, what started the Arab Spring was a shortage of cooking oil and grain. And most of what comes in the Middle East and Africa comes out of Ukraine. So it's a real global problem now that there's going to be a lot of people saying, when are we going to get this over with? I have no idea how it's going to end. I think the only person that knows that is Putin, and he hasn't called me yet. And I think but the bigger issue is it's very early to draw lessons learned from this conflict. Initially, I was reading how, this is the world of javelin and switchblade, the tank is dead, and all these other things. Well, not so much. When you talk to Ukrainians, they say the biggest killer we have on the battlefield is still artillery. These small things slowed them down, as did the terrain, but what we're killing them with is artillery, and we need more, obviously. I catch it for you?
Yeah, it does, Dave. It's a great kickstart for the discussion. The United States is historically very concerned with collateral damage and civilian casualties. Urban warfare, as we learned in Iraq, very costly for the offender going in and trying to clear the town. But that doesn't seem to be the concern of the Russians. They are rubbleizing cities, I think is the verb that people are using. Could you talk about that? Is this something new, or is this basically Russian warfare?
So I think what we have to understand is this is a different war than the war we've been fighting for 30 years, where our objective has been to avoid collateral damage and prevent casualties with civilians. Well, the Russians don't really care about that. In fact, they're using these weapons as terror weapons in some ways. But I would tell you that, in this kind of war, if you go back to the last time we actually fought this kind of fight, which is probably Korea and World War II, you use what's necessary to prevail against the adversary. And the assumption generally is that in these places, civilians are either gone or they're hiding. I mean, most of them are gone, quite frankly. The migration out of these areas was unbelievable. I mean, there's places there's nobody left at. And so the assumption, I think the Russians would do it regardless, but in a combat zone like this against a state adversary, this is a gunfight. And the objective is, collateral damage sometimes is actually a good thing. I got the rocket, I got the radar, and I got the crew. We've been focused on getting the radar. And that's not the kind of fight this is.
Yeah, this is staggering with regard to the amount of casualties they're inflicting on the Ukrainians, but they have taken a lot of casualties themselves. Do they really not care about their people?
So, every day I read about the casualties, it ranges widely. I think one of the things we have to understand, and I applaud them for it, the Ukrainians are managing the message in this war. The Russians don't tell you anything other than what they want you to know. Well, Ukrainians are doing the same thing, quite frankly, and they're very effective at it. And they're the good guys. That's what it boils down to in the press, and they really are. But that aura of help us, we're doing the right thing, keeps us from really being able to ask, well, what about how many casualties have you had? Was the combat effectiveness of your units? And those are state secrets, and they ought to be. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying they're very good at it, and they're very good at operational security. So the point I'm making, we really don't know the status of the Ukrainian military forces. And, again, kudos for them, because I wouldn't want anybody to know either. But you have to be very sanguine about any information you're getting out about number of vehicles destroyed, Russian casualties. I mean, the difference between our estimate and the Ukraine estimate at one point was like 15,000 dead. So, they want that story to be that way. And quite frankly, everybody cares about their people, but they care about their country more than they care about. I mean, when you listen to interviews with regular Ukrainian soldiers or other foreign soldiers who go on to fight there, they're fighting for a cause. The Russians are fighting, in my view, what they've always fought for, which is Mother Russia. And we just do not understand the depth of that in Russian culture. Putin's popularity is still high. I read a book for a book discussion group, my wife's at the Cosmos Club, called Haji Marat by Tolstoy. It's about Chechen rebels in the 18th, 19th century. Same exact kind of war. They're going into towns, burning them to the ground, scorched earth, killing prisoners to take control of the revolution. So this is not different. They've been doing this for hundreds of years. And this same conscript army led by incompetent NCOs, by corrupt officers, defeated Nazi Germany. So I would not write them off.
No, certainly not. So great description of what's going on the ground. Let's turn to the air domain just for a second. If you were to look and do an analysis of the world, probably the second best air force in the world is the Russians with regard to bombers and fighters, and their technology, at least from the outside, is pretty leading edge. And yet they haven't done much with it, at least from the outside. Rebecca, could you talk a little bit about how the Russians have used air power and why it hasn't materialized into something more significant with regard to the movement of their forces?
Well, there are really two sides to this story, but we have to start with the fact that Russia has not gained air superiority over Ukraine. We used to hear on a daily basis, really, from the Pentagon briefers how proud they were of that fact. I'd say it sort of has two meanings, though. One, that means that they haven't stretched that air superiority, of course, across Ukraine, but most of the fighting now is in the east and in the south. It also means they don't really have complete air superiority in the Black Sea. But we should make no mistake, because Russia nonetheless seems to be able to use their air power, often rather ineptly, but to achieve the limited objectives that they have set for it. It's a complement now, as Dave said, to the artillery and the tank battles. They are still able to launch terror bombing, although if you look at the total numbers of air and missile strikes, they are probably around 3,000. And if you look at, by the standards of even Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, that's actually not a big number in terms of ordnance and strikes. Nonetheless, they're devastating and effective because they simply don't care what they hit. The theater in Mariupol, no problem. The other thing that Russia has done, though, is to provide a type of air lockout around that area. And I hate to say it, but they've been very effective in chasing away any thought of a NATO no-fly zone prior to or in the early days of the conflict. They've also pretty effectively prevented any Western use of air power other than the systems that we have directly given to them. That said, Russia's performance in the air has been terrible. Turns out, really, they were just sort of a continental air force. They don't like to fly at night. They don't like to fly very far into Ukraine. Pictures suggest to me and to you that sometimes they get caught evading a SAM and pickle off ordnance in order to escape. And we also know that frequently they will take off over their own airfield, get to altitude, launch a cruise missile on a target in Ukraine, go back and land. Not an impressive performance in any way. But I agree with my colleague here who says it's very early to draw lessons. There are a lot to be drawn. We'll probably talk about a few. But I think one question we have to start asking ourselves is, how did we happen to overestimate the abilities of the Russian Air Force, and most of all, their abilities to work in what we call a combined arms or joint campaign.
Yeah, to the average American, that joint campaign, combined arms, integrating air systems with the movement of the armor units on the ground, seems like it would be relatively easy, at least to the average American. Is it really that easy?
Of course not. It's just that we practice and do it well. But the Russians' inability to integrate is why they were not able to carry out maneuver warfare in their drive on Kyiv. To me, a very significant moment was when Ukraine took back the Hostomel airfield near Kyiv. Russia had attempted an ambitious air assault in those early days as part of taking down Ukraine in one stroke, and it failed for two reasons. One, they simply did not bring near enough forces to hold the airfield, and then they had no ability to resupply or reinforce. And thank heavens, so the Ukrainians chased them off the airfield. That meant no ability to fly in additional forces and execute operations around Kyiv, and they got chased back, which was terrific. Because they did not have that air superiority over their maneuver columns, which would have been basic to Patton in World War II, right? The Ukrainians were able to use their shorter range systems against those forces and had the happy outcome of chasing them away from Kiev. But it has been a surprise, the lack of the level of integration. Russians boasted that they were learning a lot from flying down in Syria out of Latakia. Looks to me like they didn't learn much, nor did the vaunted Gerasimov doctrinal reforms extend in any way to the Air Force.
Yeah, for a fighter pilot, if you look at the systems that are in play here, the S-300 that the Ukrainians have is a significantly capable system. As the S-400, its follow-on, is the ones that the Russians have. It has surprised me, and I'm not sure it has you, the lack of at least reported suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD, that the Russians have not launched on the Ukrainians. Their anti-radiation missiles were things that we talked about for years, both air-to-air, being able to home in on radars that our fighters had, and with their ability to hit surface-to-air missile systems. Could you talk a little bit about why that might be?
Couple of reasons. One, during and after Vietnam, American pilots, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, became experts in suppression of enemy air defenses. It was the core doctrine that saw us through Desert Storm and many other types of operations and plans for the Cold War. Evidently, the Russians either didn't integrate that, practice it enough, somehow that broke down and didn't occur in Russia. Second and very important part, although they've only dropped a few hints, our military leadership, both from General Walters in Europe and the Joint Staff here, have made it pretty clear that we have significantly assisted Ukraine with some key intelligence and, most of all, the ability to keep control of the cyber domain. That's been the answer in allowing Ukraine's air defenses to maintain their systems. And then Ukraine, like most other nations in the world, but not like the US, integrates air defense with the rest of their air forces, unlike us where we split that still between the Army and the Air Force and Navy. So they do have a good integrated system. Remember, our Fresno Air National Guard in California began training missions with Ukraine's Air Force back in 2017. I think they passed some of those lessons along. It's been very successful, and I think a real, we'll hear about the details probably 10 or 15 years from now, but a real high point for U.S. and allied assistance to Ukraine and for Ukrainian operations.
Well, fabulous. So let's turn to our cyber guest. Brian, if you could come up, bring yourself up on screen. The Russian Navy has actually increased its operations in the Black Sea as of late, there have been several rather largely reported incidents that have involved them. Could you talk a little bit about how they have, the Navy, the Russian Navy, has been involved from the beginning and how that's morphed over the time, the last 6 months?
Yeah, JV, and thanks for inviting me to participate. The Russian Navy has, suffered some of the most catastrophic, most visible losses of the war, and it's created a lot of news coverage. And I can talk a little bit about that. And so, but I'd say first of all, the biggest challenge that we're facing today worldwide is the food shortages that are resulting from the Russian blockade of Odessa. And so in a lot of ways, the naval fight is the one that's the most consequential for the rest of the world. Although, as David mentions, the fight on the ground is clearly the most consequential for the Ukrainians themselves. So if you could bring up that first slide, I think what's interesting to note is early on in the war, there you go. So early on in the war, the Western powers, the U.S., NATO allies, all retreated from the Black Sea in the lead up to the conflict. And so Russia largely had the Black Sea to itself. It essentially became a Russian lake, except for the coastal areas around Turkey and maybe Bulgaria and Romania. But it largely had control of the Sea of Azov all the way down to the Bosporus. And the Black Sea fleet that they used to control that you see on the slide here, is a couple dozen ships. It's a pretty sizable force, considering the size of the water mass there. But the Ukrainians didn't have much of a navy to combat the Russians. The NATO allies largely had withdrawn, except for the coasts around the Black Sea, leaving Russia to essentially control the Black Sea for itself. Which they've used to then create this blockade. Despite that, though, they have suffered some very catastrophic losses that we've all seen in the news. So the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet that you see there, was lost to a missile attack, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then they've lost some amphibious ships that were positioned a little bit too close to shore, and those were all lost to precision weapons wielded by the Ukrainians that were able to patch together a battle network using assistance from the West that was able to go and attack these ships at long range and create some devastating consequences and some good headlines for themselves. A couple of things to note here is that, so you see on the right-hand side of that slide, the Bosporus Strait is still being controlled by Turkey under the Montreux Convention, which has not allowed any ships to go into the Black Sea to any military ships that are not based there to enter the Black Sea, which means Russia can't replace these ships or reinforce them, the ones that are lost, or add to them. And also the West has chosen not to, and also technically cannot deploy any ships in there to help Ukraine out in terms of breaking the blockade. And you can see on the lower right-hand side there, those are the ships that the U.S. Navy has in Rota that all returned home to Rota, Spain, at the early stages of the conflict to avoid there being a confrontation with the Russians. And so you can take that slide down. But the upshot of that is that the Russians have been able to largely control the Black Sea despite some significant losses. Actually, if you can go to that next slide, I will talk a little bit about that. So the Russian losses that they suffered in the Black Sea, the Moskva and also these amphibious ships, were the result of the Ukrainians taking advantage of some precision weapons that they had themselves. So the Neptune cruise missile that you see down there on the lower right-hand side is a indigenous cruise missile that was built by the Ukrainians using old Russian technology and some newer microelectronics. So that's a domestic cruise missile and a ship missile that they made, that they were able to employ to sink the Moskva. Now, the Moskva obviously had issues with regard to its air defense capabilities and its readiness, but still, it's a significant lesson here that really it just takes one missile to get through to hit a modern warship for it to be at least out of action and potentially out completely as a result of the fires and other damage that might result. The other thing that was interesting about those attacks was how they were able to leverage intelligence from the West, satellite imagery that was being provided by a variety, almost a dozen Western satellite imagery companies were providing intelligence information to the Ukrainians, which gives them a rough idea of where the ships are, that they were able to then engage using these anti-ship cruise missiles and unmanned air vehicles like the Bayraktar 2v2 that they used to confuse Russian air defenses, as well as provide some targeting that helped direct the final cruise missile attacks. So the Ukrainians have been doing a great job, and you can take the slide down now, of assembling battle networks that allow them to conduct these long-range precision attacks that have left the Russians on the defensive and keeping their fleet largely out to sea to avoid further losses. But that doesn't change the fact that the Russians still control the Black Sea, still control the ability for Ukraine to get any exports out or bring any imports in via the Bosporus or the Black Sea.
Now, Brian, is that their biggest impact? So the Russian Navy has taken some big losses. Is their biggest impact the embargo they're putting on the grain, or actually have they inflicted damage on the Ukrainian forces?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the Russian Navy has launched cruise missile attacks on Ukraine. In part, that is to just show that they're ready to do that. I think that was a demonstration on the Russians' part to show that their ships actually had weapons that they could use. It's also because the Russians were starting to run out of weapons. So their precision weapons inventory was running low, and they've launched attacks from the frigates that are in the Black Sea, as well as the Kilo submarines that are in the Black Sea. In part because they needed those precision weapons to augment what was available from air launch systems that were based in Russia.
Yeah, great. So Snake Island seems like it's always in the news one way or another. What's the strategic significance of Snake Island, if there is one?
Yeah, so that's just like the attacks on the ships, they have more of a public relations value than an actual military value. So the loss of the Moskva, the loss of those couple of amphibious ships really didn't change anything in terms of the balance of power at sea. The Russians still have control of the Black Sea. They can still prevent any any Ukrainian exports that the Russians don't allow. And so similar to that, Snake Island, if you pull up that last slide, I do have a map. The last slide on that deck, we can see the map that kind of shows where the situation is on the water. But Snake Island is about 60 miles offshore. Go one more slide. Oh, one more. Oh, okay. Well, regardless, so Snake Island is about 60 miles offshore, but it's about a 350 to 400 mile transit from Odessa all the way to the Bosporus Strait. So Snake Island allows the Ukrainians to better control the entrances to the port of Odessa and the Gulf that Odessa sits in, which prevents the Russians from maybe getting in there, maybe because the Ukrainians can attack them at sea. But it doesn't really help Ukraine in its biggest problem, which is trying to protect its exports, trying to get out of the Bosphorus. So there's about 200 miles of transit lane that is not currently covered by any Ukrainian weapon system or ship that allows the Russians to control access in and out of the port of Odessa. So Snake Island, although it's a good victory in terms of the media battle, the narrative battle, it doesn't necessarily change that fundamental fact that Ukraine is still cut off from the rest of the world at sea.
You talked about the strait that the Turks control, and that they've got it locked up. Do you think the Russians will actually try to reinforce their Black Sea fleet over the next several months?
Oh, they would try. Well, they've tried to, and they've been rebuked by the Turks. And so, one thing that the Russians are looking to try to do is come up with some kind of grand bargain here, where if they were to allow exports of grain to come out of Ukraine, can they get the Turks to agree to allow Russia to reinforce or at least replace ships in the Black Sea fleet that have been lost? Or that need to be removed due to the need for repairs. So Russia is trying to work this out as part of its negotiations with NATO and with Turkey in particular. And of course, if Turkey allows that, then the question will be, if Turkey is going to allow access by warships into the Black Sea, will they allow access from Western NATO allies as well that are not based in the Black Sea? So under the Montreux Convention, Turkey could still keep them out. But the question is, would they allow those ships to enter to try to escort grain exports?
Great question, great thought. So let's turn to the Ukrainian order of battle, if we can, just for a couple of minutes. We've got about 15 minutes left, so it'll be kind of a quick round. Dave, we watched the Ukrainians change over the last several years. If you go back to 2014, Russians, or Russian rebels, if you will, did a big land grab in the Donbass region that went kind of almost overnight. What changed? What's changed over the last 8 years?
So I think what fundamentally changed, and one, there's been a lot of governmental reforms in Ukraine, but the military was fundamentally reformed. They got rid of a bunch of the old, basically Soviet generals that were running the system. And we make a lot out of this about NATO training. I don't think it's as much as we are making it out to be, but it made a significant difference. That is a professionalized army that's getting trained, and it's a merit-based system. A lot of the really bad things that were there from the Soviet days have been ameliorated. So I think they also were woken up by the fact what happened when the Russians came in. And they also got combat experience from fighting that for the last number of years. So this is an army that, has been rotating its active forces in and out of that area for a number of years. It's gotten very experienced, has decent leadership, and they're just much better than they were. And they're aware that there's a problem. I think they were taken off guard by Crimea and Donbass like everybody else was.
The United States has provided a lot of things to Ukraine. I think all three of you have touched on the intel and the cyber aspects of it. We've HIMARS, the anti-tank systems and the likes. What's been most effective and what's been least effective?
So I think recently what we've been seeing and hearing is HIMARS. One, it's the 777 howitzer is not particularly mobile. It takes 8 to 10 minutes to set up and fire and move. And it has no armor at all. So once it fires, if it's acquired, you've got a lot of time to find it. If you find it, you'll kill it. HIMARS shoots and just drives down the road. It displaces really quickly. It's not very, particularly great cross-country, but they're not using it cross-country, using these mesh of farm roads and, and tracks. So I think HIMARS is really the thing that's making the most difference right now. The Germans I just read today, are going to provide 100 SPH-2000s, which is a magnificent howitzer. And it's an armored system that has a high rate of fire that could really contribute as well. But what they need is to win the artillery fight, because that's what's enabling the Russians to dominate where they are dominating, because they just have the weight of metal on their side right now.
Yeah, Dave, this war of attrition seems to have kicked in now. And Zelensky, as much control as he's had over the media and casualty rates, he himself has said they are suffering between 150 and 200 KIA a day,
right,
and up to 500 wounded in action a day. And the numbers are likely higher than that. How long can Ukraine sustain this kind of fight?
So the first thing I'd do is caveat when he said that. It was about the same time he's really begging for HIMARS. And it was a time that was really intense in one fight. I don't think that's continued at that rate over time. But even if it hasn't, as a military historian, you have to say something about Clausewitz at some point. But, what he said was fundamentally, nobody reads this part. We all read the things we want to read. But he said in a war of exhaustion, don't become exhausted first. And that is the challenge for both sides right now. How long can you stay in the fight? It's a real lesson for us. We'll talk about lessons later, but the enormity of the munitions and people and supplies that they're both going through every single day, it's just unimaginable for us that in a military that we've built that thinks about short, sharp wars, everybody's saying this is a long war. It took the Germans in World War II with 3 million something people 3 months just to get to Kyiv. So this is not a long war yet. And long wars, ironically, with smaller forces, become more protracted because you don't have mass for decisiveness, particularly when you don't control the air.
Fantastic. So turn to the air side. The Ukrainian Air Force, before the war started, had Su-27s, MiG-29s, and their basic A-10 variant, which is the Frogfoot. But the rhetoric that we've heard has been muted coming out. Reportedly, a good day for a Ukrainian fighter pilot is to take off, go out and do a recce sortie of some sort, and then come back without being shot down. Could you talk about the effectiveness of the Ukrainian Air Force and what they may need in order to boost their efforts?
Yes, and they've been tremendously effective, but as you know, it's about sustaining it, and one of those pilots apparently was shot down on July 26th, Major Kukurba, age 28, 100th mission. And that's exactly the type of experienced combat aviator that you don't want to lose. And so the question for Ukraine is is there any pilot training going on? Is anybody getting checked out on the systems? What's the pipeline to sustain that? Some of the good news, I think, has occurred with drones, which have enabled a level of battlefield surveillance and of precision targeting assistance. There are a lot of ways it's done, but helping out systems like HIMARS. So in a case where we've decided Ukraine doesn't get much strike air power, the drones have been of tremendous assistance both in their own targeting and in their providing of that battle space picture. Just been very, very effective there. I think for Ukraine, though, again, we don't have a totally clear picture of their losses and their situation. We know they're fighting very hard, but I am hoping someone is sitting there helping them assess how to keep this going for the next 3 months and the next 3 months after that if required. Of course, we know the great tragedy every week is the aircraft we're not giving them, not the MiG-29s, not the Predator, for Pete's sake, the Gray Eagles, not, this variant of helicopter, and, now not F-16s or F-15s, although the House would like to authorize something like that. Not so many times we tell the Air Force no.
Yeah, many people talk about these, the fighter gifts, and they go MiG-29, they're flying the MiG-29, might be an easy transition, but that's not what the Ukrainians want. If we were to give them F-16s, what would be the long pole in the tent with regard to training? Is it the pilots, maintainers, logistics? Could you talk a bit about that?
It looks to me like the long pole in the tent is a little bit of all that, but it's not such a terribly long pole. If we were to give them F-16s, I think that would have to come along with the stateside training and the maintenance training to make them able to sustain that. Frankly, whether it's F-16s, which would be better for them, or the old MiG-29s, whatever it would be, the long pole in the tent for us on air is really policy. A fear of escalation is preventing any executive level serious discussion of this, although it seems to me that Congress, if you ask the American people, would they vote to send airplanes for Ukraine, I think they would all vote yes very quickly.
Yeah, no, fabulous. So Brian, let me turn to you. The Ukraine doesn't have much in the way of a Navy, and at least we haven't heard much of it, but they have some significant counter-naval systems. Could you talk about their effectiveness and how they're able to keep maybe the Russian Navy at bay?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Ukraine's Navy was pretty small. It consisted of a few corvettes, smaller inland or rather coastal defense ships, and then some patrol craft. So not a very big force. And a lot of that was eliminated very quickly in the war by Russian forces. So Ukraine really hasn't been able to do very much at sea. But what they have been able to do, as you said, is leverage their anti-ship weapons that are launched from shore to be able to hold off the Russian Navy. So I talked earlier about the Moskva being sunk by a couple of domestic Neptune anti-ship missiles, which the Ukrainians built themselves. They had a relatively small number of them, but they can always build more. They recently were provided Harpoon anti-ship missiles from Denmark that were a ground-launched version that the U.S. doesn't have yet, but is building some now. Those have been actually used a couple of times against some resupply efforts to Snake Island prior to Snake Island falling back to Ukrainian hands. So they attacked the salvage ship that was being used to resupply Snake Island with Harpoon cruise missiles. And they've also taken advantage of the Bayraktar's ability to go out and do surveillance and targeting, as well as confuse air defense systems on Russian ships to be able to help guide some of their missile attacks. And the last one I say is that the amphibious ships that were in port that were attacked early in the war were attacked by, it looks like a combination of rockets and ballistic missiles, so relatively unsophisticated ground cruise missiles that, or rather ballistic missiles that were left over from the Soviet era in part, were used to attack those ships. So the Ukrainians have really done a great job of taking advantage of the small number of anti-ship weapons they had, leveraging commercial surveillance from satellite imagery companies to give them a rough idea of where ships are, and then using their UAVs to get that final tactical targeting that allows them to put the missile on the actual ship and take it out. They've also been able to take advantage of communication networks like Starlink to be able to pass that targeted information from a terminal that's getting the download of the satellite information from the commercial companies and providing that to the missile launcher, which is somewhere else. So the Starlink system has been a real benefit to them in terms of doing the command and control necessary for these missile attacks.
Is the imagery link, so the time you request imagery to come down from a commercial provider, to be able to find and fix a Russian surface vessel, Is it timely enough where their systems can actually go in and inquire it, or would they need more timely U.S. intel to make that happen?
So in a lot of cases, the commercial intel is going to be satisfactory. So the latency on it, varies obviously, but a lot of those systems can give you latency of less than half an hour. Especially these Russian ships are not moving around very much, if at all. In some cases, they're just sort of loitering either at anchor or just in a fixed spot out in the Black Sea, trying to stay hidden and off the coast far enough to avoid attack. So the fact that they're not moving very fast or very far means you can use that satellite imagery and then launch on that and hope that the missile is able to do the rest of the job with its seeker, like the harpoon can. Or you're going to use a Bayraktar or some UAV to be able to get that final targeting information. You need to know where to send the UAV though. So the commercial imagery gives you enough of an idea of where to go that you can send the UAV to get the final targeting and then launch the attack as soon as you obtain that.
Fabulous. Well, let's turn to lessons learned out of this conflict for the United States and what we can take away from it. For the last 25, 30 years, we've actually used our joint weapon systems and our air, land, and sea domains quite effectively, as well as cyber, to go in and prosecute low threat environments and unsophisticated enemies. But now we're looking at a very sophisticated set of enemies. Even what used to be known as the third world nation, Ukraine, has done some exceptional things in this war. So how has this war changed the way we look at conflict? And I'll talk with each of the domain experts. And Dave, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so I wrote an article a few weeks ago about, what can we learn about ourselves from this war? Because I think we're saying the Russians just don't have it together because they got crummy people and they're not well trained. And I think part of this is relevant combat experience and relevant operational experience with large units. The last time we put multiple corps in the field was Desert Storm, where we thought we were going to fight a competent enemy, and they only contested us really in the land domain. The air domain was taken care of really quickly. So the ability, when you look at what the Russians attempted initially, 4 axes that are separated in some cases by 400 kilometers, it's a difficult problem to command and control and support logistically forces like that across that expanse. So I think there's a lot we can learn about what does it really take to operate large forces in the field, particularly when you're contested in all the domains. I'll add some of what Rebecca said. The Army has not operated without air cover since 1918. The last time an American soldier was killed by an airplane, April 1953, by essentially a hand grenade out of a biplane that North Koreans used to fly. And so we've become used to operating without looking over our shoulder for red air. We've become used to tightly integrated air-ground operations. I don't know how effective the air defense systems are. Is it because they're bad pilots that they're not flying, or because the air defense threat is significant enough to make people be really wary? I think it's probably a combination of both, but we have not flown against air defenses since Desert Storm. OAF, we've taken care of in Northern Watch and Southern Watch, essentially. So I think that, coupled with the idea that these are short, decisive wars with low casualties, isn't true in this kind of war. These are back to days of Korea and World War II. The discussion we had about collateral damage, I wrote an article talking about what the Russians, their accuracy for them is I hit the city. I hit Mariupol. That's what I'm trying to do. I talked to my dad when, he's a paratrooper in World War II. So they pull up to a German village. If they got fire from the village, and there's a white flag, they pull out and level it with artillery and go to the next village. Every veteran I talk to at the end of the war says essentially the same thing. If they want to fight, we're going to fight with what we fight with. So this is what real war looks like, and we haven't seen it in so long, we've forgotten it. And it's particularly true in Europe, where they've not been involved in anything in 70 years, essentially, but peacekeeping operations. So things like casualty evacuation, how are we going to feel about, in the United States, having 1,000 casualties in 2 days? That is going to be a shock to the system we need to prepare ourselves for. We need to prepare a medical system for that. The industrial base, we are buying weapons like Excalibur's, a 155 round that costs $170,000 a round. A regular 1.5 round costs $300 to $1,000 per round. You can buy a lot of dumb bullets, and they're just as accurate after the first round. And what you need in these kind of fights are area effects and mass effects against large formations. And that's just something we haven't thought about in so long. And most of our inventories are precision weapons, and the opportunity cost is everything else. So taking a look at, how would we have done if we were the Russians trying to do this? The flip side, that I think is more important, quite frankly, in NATO and in Pacific, is we're not there to win an offensive fight, we're there to deter. So what does it take to stop this kind of adversary and make him be convinced he's not going to be successful? In other words, a strategy of denial. And what does it take to have on the ground to do that and in the air? And if he does do something, how do you stop him and how do you compel him to leave at the operational level so you don't escalate? Because I don't think it's not an escalatory ladder, it's an escalator once you get on it. I mean, you're going to go to the top with the Russians if you start using nukes. So the question to me is, how do you keep this at the operational level and prevent aggression? And if it happens, it's more like Desert Storm. He doesn't get to invade Saudi Arabia, and I kick him out of Kuwait. So those are the kinds of things I think we need to be thinking about. We're not really, quite frankly, thinking much about those. We're an expeditionary army based in CONUS.
A great summary, Dave. So the air side of this is also interesting to think about. If you go and ask Putin the day before the war if he thought his military was ready to go, I think he was told his military was ready to go and would be in Kyiv in 2 to 3 days. You have to wonder how much that truth hurt that process and his decision-making process. But the same thing is true with other militaries. And so, Rebecca, could you talk a little bit about how we're prepared today to go to war and what the training levels are and the intensity with regard to the U.S. Air Forces? Right,
and preliminary lessons. And as we know, our pilots aren't flying as much as they should, and our inventories are not modernized to the level that they should be. I'll run through a couple of quick lessons that really apply to us as much as anyone. We do not fight without air power. Not going to do that. It is brutal, ugly, and unnecessary. Second, cyber has to be solid in place from day one. I'd say the third lesson we see is that drones of many types are now really fully integrated across the find, fix, and target kill chain. And there will be questions about how that looks when you've got a big air campaign at the same time, but drones are here to stay and we need the counter-drone operations. We have some very harsh lessons for U.S. policy. The no-fly zone policy option, which we've used successfully over the decades, failed, didn't happen. We can see that unless you have air superiority, you can't do things like aerial resupply into Mariupol, which was done by helicopter for a while. Back to the good side, we see that NATO wants air deterrence. 3 more countries just went out and bought the F-35, and part of the reason behind that is because of extended nuclear deterrence. We had a curtain of air power along the NATO border when the Ukraine war kicked off. NATO is going to want very strong, very first-rate air power for generations to come after Ukraine wins this war.
Oh, great. So Brian, turn to you. Neptune's been awfully effective against the Russians. Talk to us about how the United States will see the next war and the great power competition and how the lessons out of this one will apply to it.
Yeah, so clearly one lesson out of this is that precision weapons are a big problem for ships, and that even if you've got air defenses, it just takes one of those weapons to get through to take your ship out of action, because basically it's all hands to do damage control instead of fighting the ship. And then also you could lose the ship very easily. So Air defense has risen again in importance for the U.S. Navy. There's been a lot of discussion about directed energy, lasers being used for air defense to a greater degree. I think one thing it's going to do is really refocus navalists on short-range defenses that have high capacity, because I think one of the issues that the Navy currently has, our Navy and other navies, is that we tend to try to shoot incoming threats as far away as possible, which means you're using the biggest, most expensive surface-to-air missiles you have to try to take out those first tranche of incoming cruise missiles. And you need to start thinking about, I need smaller weapons that I can carry more of, because I might have to deal with more than just a couple of missiles. I might have to deal with dozens of missiles over a protracted conflict. I need that capacity. So there's definitely a move afoot to try to reconsider how we do air defense for ships. And maybe move away from the large area air defense and move more towards the shorter range defenses that might have a higher capacity. And then I'd say the other thing is that electronic warfare, which has been a long-standing way of doing air defense for the U.S. Navy and other navies, is getting reinvigorated, because I think there's recognition that it's a deeper magazine, if you will, than what you get with a surface-to-air missile. And EW is now starting to make its presence known in the Ukraine conflict on the ground. I think we're going to probably see a little bit more of it at sea as the conflict progresses.
Great. Wonderful summation. Back to the basics seems to be something that's floating in the back of my mind. It was the Bonhomme Richard that burned and has basically been toasted. And basic firefighting skills, things that we, survival to operate things in all of the domains, seem to need to be revised. And it'll be interesting to see how all of the services come forward with that. If we go over 1 hour, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to end up paying for this line out of pocket. So I'm going to try to get a couple of questions, one from online and one from the audience here in just a second. So if you would bring the microphone forward, or you can just tell me what it is and I'll repeat it, Fred. Here it comes. The willingness of the United States and the West to provide more stuff for Ukraine.
Holding us back, what are the impediments, what are the systems that would make a difference?
What is holding us back from providing more? What impetus would make a difference? And I'll throw it out to the three of you.
I'll jump in first, if that's okay. I think we see a case where we thought Russia would win fast. Therefore, we've been in catch-up mode on the branches and sequels. What does that picture of victory look like? That's made it hard to select the correct systems. We have also let ourselves be very self-deterred, and I think we see it honestly from the White House does not want to go toe-to-toe with Russia. That has had an incredible policy impact. And then I think there are some smaller issues here. Let me go back to the Gray Eagles, which are supposed to be provided, just 4 of them. But remember, those Gray Eagles each belong to a specific Army unit. No commander is going to want to give them up. We have seen the Joint Staff, I think, step into the breach and try to scramble equipment and systems to Ukraine. But we need that guiding Casablanca, the plan for victory, however long or short it will be, in order to supply more. And Russia cannot win this war. We have got to come up with this. We've got to stop doing things like letting Russia's Air Force have that sanctuary, is like the Yalu River. So the greatest holdup on what to give is the operational concept and the political will to implement it.
Brian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think Dave and Rebecca both brought up is that giving more is a problem because we don't have more to give. The West is now running low on its own stocks of precision weapons and some of these sensors and launcher systems, so that's a problem. And then the other question is, like Rebecca brings up, is different. So we can't give more, but we could give different. We could give Ukrainians capabilities that allow them to have a longer reach, like UAVs. Like longer range missiles that could go in the HIMARS, that would allow them to actually start taking the fight back to the Russians and taking out some of the targets that are supporting the Russian offensive, even if they are targets that are inside Russia. I think that's the decision now, is do we start to give them different because we can't give them any more of what they were already getting?
Great point. Dave?
Yeah, so I wrote something a few weeks ago to go back to what Brian said, that, are we the arsenal of democracy or not? And my sense is there's countries that are pushing back because they're running short on what they have. Well, that's fine. I mean, what we bought them for is what they're doing with them. They're killing Russians. Okay, so give them whatever we got and build more. The question isn't, we have low arsenals. The question is we need to build bigger arsenals. And our industry, there's moves afoot to do that. But I think the way you decide what they need is to look at what's going to hurt the Russians the most. And what I've seen so far with the HIMARS that's really been valuable is not, doing the plinking Russian artillery systems, but going after ammo depots, command and control. One of the big lessons that everybody in this room needs to learn, if you're on a battlefield, is do not have your cell phone with you. This is how they're finding folks. This is how they found people in Lebanon in 2006. We all think for some reason nobody can listen to you on your cell phone. Ask the German or the Russian generals who are, laying feet up right now how that went. But headquarters that are big that emit, it takes a long time to move these large, soft targets now that we got used to in Afghanistan and Iraq because nobody was shooting at them. They're just emitting so much energy, they're just a magnet for artillery. But I would say what they need is what we can sustain. Because right now Germans give them howitzers, we're giving them howitzers, the French, they're all different. They fire the same ammunition, but the maintenance, the logistics are all different. So we're adding to their maintenance problems by what we give them. I've got a different view on the no-fly zone from the perspective of it's not just saying they can't fly here. You've got to also take out their radars for the S-400s inside of Russia if you're going to guarantee our ability to fly in that area. But that's a policy question that we've not really addressed head on. But there are things we can do that can really hurt the Russians. And the excuse of, well, we won't have them ourselves, well, we won't fight that T-72 10 years from now because it'll be dead.
Well, great answers and really enjoyed the conversation, sir. I'm so sorry. We're not going to have time for your question, but maybe we can get to it after this is over. I want to take a minute to thank our great guest. Brian, thank you. Rebecca, Dave, your expertise is greatly valued, and I cherish your time with us, and thank you for being part of this. And ladies and gentlemen, both here in the live audience and at home in virtual land, thank you for joining us. You're going to get a survey over the course of the next several days. Really would enjoy it if you would take a minute to fill that out. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great Thursday afternoon. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.